Hello class, I wanted to give another demonstration of working with detail, and so since your homework this week is to do a trompe l'oeil illusion drawing, I thought I would demo how I would work with the graphite pencils to pull off an assignment like that. So simple setup will work for this week's homework. Sometimes simpler is better. And just as a reminder, when you're working with graphite, you want to work lightly at first with pressure. So that way you can erase out those mistake lines later. And right now I'm just eyeballing to lightly get my line work in. This is going to cut it a little close by drawing. So I readjusted it, so I need to redraw the contours. If you draw your subject one-to-one, it can be nice to measure you can actually place the distances down, which is a little wide there. So I can actually check those distances. And from my viewpoint, they're going to be a little different than the actual measurement, but I'm just going to lightly get my line work in. I arranged the scene the way I did so that way there'd be areas of value and the shadows are clear. Okay. So now with the loose line work, I'm gonna do some measuring. So the shadow at its widest is 1/2 of the paper, the little slip of paper. So I can keep that constant. Remember, something's only off compared to something else in the composition. I'm holding my pencil on its side to lay down material quicker. I made the mental note, I don't have enough space here. Okay, that looks better. The good news with subjects like this is no one's going to see your subjects, so you have some room for making errors on subject matter like stones or a crumpled piece of paper that you don't have on, say, a human face. Okay, so now the shadow looks like it's the proper length. I'm just going to measure the shadow of this white rock. It's 1/2 of the actual stone, so my measurement holds up. And then we have a darker occlusion shadow back here. And I'm checking out the negative space to see how high the shadow should come. And I notice that this cast shadow is creeping down a little bit below my form. I'm going to measure the distance between the two stones. It's a little bit less than one width of the white stone. Okay, so I think this is actually where the stone is. And then I shifted it a little bit from my first position. You want to get in the habit of keeping your paper clean. So carefully erase marks that can be erased. I'm just going to check how much wider my stone is than it is tall. That holds up. And I chose two different values for the rocks on purpose. You want to make smart choices about your subject matter to help support the drawing. Okay, and the creases in this crumpled paper, that's going to be more effective to lay a bit of a ground. So I was asked recently how to work with a graphite ground, and you can lay a ground on an entire sheet of paper with graphite by using the side of the pencil. You can also, once you have your line work down, lay down a selective ground inside the contour of your form, if it makes sense. And since this crumpled paper is newsprint, it makes sense to have some drawing material down. Okay, so now I'm going to take a bit of paper towel and blend, because there's no texture when I look into the shadow. It's all smooth, so I want to be smooth in my drawing. I'm going to blend this, and after blending you can get more accurate of a picture how dark your value went, and if it needs to go darker. So I'm going to take this dirty paper towel now and use it to effectively set a light ground on my little piece of paper. Okay, so now that I have ground, I can erase up. And this is just a push-up eraser. I can erase up my lightest areas. So some of you are still having trouble with hard edges, and I just want to show you that carefully using an eraser with pressure can create a really effective edge. And I've been noticing that my cast shadow here has gotten wider than it is when I'm looking at it in life. It's also the wrong shape up here. So that's closer to what I'm seeing. I'm going to erase some of my initial contour lines now that they're shading, because we want to be relying on the shading over line, because nothing in real life is outlined. Sometimes things look like they have outlines, sometimes shadows look really linear. But if you look really carefully, they diffuse because they're shadows. Right now I'm just using this 2B pencil. So next, what I always like to do once I feel like the drawing's proceeded in a decent way is I like to go in and shade where my darkest values are. So right now the darkest values I'm seeing are the occlusion shadow cast by this black stone. And so I'm using quite a bit of pressure to build up the value there. And if you hold your pencil on its side, that can sometimes prevent unwanted textures from appearing. And then I just made the mental note, I have to show the distinction between the shadow and the actual rock in this. While I'm here, I'm also going to render a little bit of this paper shadow because the shadow, the cast shadow of the stone kind of connects to this shadow on the paper. I'm being careful as I'm shading this shadow part of the paper not to go over the edge of my line. This line over here. Okay, so it's a little bit more of the shading. And I always like to get the darkest part of my subject and the lightest part shaded early on so I could use that as a gauge for the other values key. So my lightest thing I'm seeing is a little bit on the white rock and then over here on the paper where it's catching highlight. So right now I'm erasing out of this graphite ground. And over here, the highlight's so bright that it actually makes it difficult to see where the edge of the paper is against. Oh no, my rock. Where the edge of the paper is against the background paper. And so I will emulate that in the drawing and let it blow out there. Okay, so my rock got nudged. So I'm just going to reposition it. To match my drawing. So I don't have to change my drawing too much. Okay, so the only thing I need to change, the new positioning is the bottom of this shadow. And then while I'm down here, I notice there's a really nice cast shadow of the paper that I want to try to capture. This is one of those moments that if you don't look carefully enough, it looks like a line, but it really isn't. It's crisper on the top, and it fades a little bit under. It's a little tiny shadow underneath the paper. And with the new rock positioning, the shape of the shadow is a little different now, so I'm going to go in there. Okay, so now I'm going to shade the black rock. I'm using the side of my pencil to avoid creating marks. I'm curving my strokes to support the fact that this is a rounded form. If you shade something straight up and down, it's gonna flatten it. And as I'm shading it, I'm trying to discern where is this darkest, this rock, and where is it lightest. And I'm noticing that it's actually got quite a bit of shadow at the top. So I'm going to tilt my pencil back to the top. And again, it takes a lot of pressure and build up and repeat applications to get the material to go as dark as it needs to create believable form. And I'm noting that the rock is darker than its shadow, and so that needs to take place of the drawing as well. Okay, there's a little hole in the rock. I'm going to render, suggest just a couple of the defects so it doesn't look like a perfectly round thing, because it doesn't when I look at it. And I'm going to try to really press quite hard here at the occlusion shadow, because it is darker there than the rock. And overall, the cast shadow can be a little darker. Okay, so now that I've shaded that some, I'm going to blend it, especially the shadow where there's no texture. I'm going to blend some of the shading I put on the paper. Okay, so now the little scrap of paper needs a bit more shading, so I'm going to go in and communicate a little bit more information. Oh, mental note, there's the negative space shape there. Off. So up here it's darker than my drawing, so I need to get that. Some material up here. And I'm shading a bit erratically because there's some crinkles that I want to just suggest. Then here, now that I'm back on this side of the drawing, this shadow needs to darken. The object of this exercise is to render something as convincingly as possible, so really think carefully about what forms might be easier to pull that off than others. Oops, oh god, again. So at this stage of the drawing, I'm going to add a bit more shading and kind of cement a bit more of the form by tightening up. Tightening up means sort of rendering the fine details as opposed to just suggesting loosely. This needs to get darker. Try to communicate a bit of the lichen on that rock by varying the mark, different than anything else that appears in the drawing. And then I want this shadow to sink down a bit more. So I'm looking at this view of this subject a little bit from the side, so it shrinks a bit. It's a little smaller in my view than it is straight down. Okay, next I'm going to grab my darker shade of pencil to get a little bit more range from my values. So I've got a 6B. And the places that need the darkest are over here. This cast shadow needs to sink back and differentiate itself, and then this cast shadow. And I'm only going to use it in those darkest moments. So the 6B was very helpful in getting the darkness that I needed. The other tool that I'm going to put to use now is the blending stump. And let's just use a homemade one. So, oops. So, as I showed you guys before, if you wrap a pencil . function just like a blending stump. Oops. Fold it over. There are some small spaces where it's impossible to get your finger in to blend carefully enough. And some of you are having issue with fine detail, and so you really got to start using the blending stumps. Or just wrap in a pencil with newsprint. The other thing that blending does is it creates different textures, and so you guys need to be doing a lot of blending for that reason as well. You can do a bit of drawing with the blending stumps too. I tend to move material around with them once they're dirty. Something's off about the distance between my stones. I bumped it a few times, but as long as it's not distracting, I'm going to leave it because nobody sees the setup. So now I've got a little bit more of the darkness I want to match. I'm going to go in and create the different areas of value as they need to read in the drawing. So I'm going to push this cast shadow down by darkening it. And this is probably the third time I've laid material down here. Those of you that are getting frustrated, just keep reapplying material. A little shadow here, I'm confident I can render. There's a bit of a shadow under the page there. Okay, so now I gotta make this marks go away. Sometimes you have to add more material to an area to get the texture to go away, and then you can actually erase up and the texture will be not as pronounced. Oops, I lost that corner. Okay, let's deepen. Once I get this far in a drawing, I tend to just move around to wherever my eye notices something needs to change. So I just notice that the shadow. So shadow darknesses need to be matched or else they will not be believable to the viewer's form. You've got to be very careful at this edge. I broke it a bit, so erase it back. I really like working with subjects like this where some of your proportions can be off, but the form can still be really convincing. Hands are not so forgiving. Okay, made the mental note that the paper above the shadow over here, it's in shadow a bit more than it is in my drawing. I want to show that this is the side of the stone because it's kind of in halftone. This crease. Okay, so I just want to suggest a couple other moments of this paper a little more accurately, like this straight crease. While I'm here, I'm going to carve out a bit of the difference between the cast shadow and the stone here. They got a little mushed together. No. communicate that this plane up here is darker in shadow. So this is getting pretty close to what I'm hoping you guys can pull off for a trompe-l'oeil illusion. The shadows are matched. There's a suggestion of the forms. I think just a little bit more blending. A couple more suggestions of creases and notice that as I move the paper, the shadow's now different, so I'll make it match. Okay, so this edge is looking a little fuzzy, so let's just harden this edge. And since that starts looking a bit like line, we want to work it into some shading. Suggest some of this crinkling. So there's looked a bit like contour lines, so I just added a bit more material and I'm going to gently erase it up. Okay, that's better. Okay. So if I were to continue working on this, I would continue to suggest some more of the features of the crinkled paper. And I say suggest because some people think that they need to draw every wrinkle and count which wrinkle am I on. Is it the 7th one in from the edge? But that's usually unnecessary, and sometimes will even make a drawing worse. So oftentimes you want to just decide what's essential to get in, what can you just sort of imply and suggest. And remember that you want to get specific with your textures, or else that will kill your illusions. That will help this. Just overall, this rock could look a little darker. And this edge is a little fuzzy. The last thing I'm doing here is just lightening this shadow so it doesn't visually compete with the rock. Because the shadow, even though it's quite dark, never gets as dark as the rock, only in the occlusion.